Good morning. This is Sarah Rose Solly, and you're listening to the Barbie Trauma Podcast. Our main goal is to share conversations that will help end the stigma surrounding mental health and trauma. Each episode, I aim to share what I've learned on my own healing journey, and also through starting a nonprofit that serves survivors of physical and sexual violence. Though some of these topics may be heavy, we vow to approach this conversation differently and more authentically than you've ever heard it before. We're here to advocate for women, education, and mental health, while also embracing the art of comedy and powerful healing vibrations of laughter. In other words, we try to not take ourselves too seriously. Welcome to episode 1. This episode is just a very brief, very casual introduction to Trauma Barbie and what kind of content you can expect to hear on this podcast. Let's start with the name. I feel Trauma Barbie suits this podcast for so many reasons. The elephant in the room being, yes, there is indeed a major motion film out there right now breaking 16 box office records in just the first 4 weekends it's been released. Barbie is back, baby. The 90s and the 80s are back too, whether we like it or not. Everything about this movie is a hot topic right now. And as I mentioned in my intro, one of the many goals we have here on the podcast is to advocate for women and female empowerment. And this movie is one of the only female-dominated movies among the top grossing films of all time. But to me, even more importantly, Barbie was a huge part of my childhood. Barbie taught little girls that they could do anything and be anything. Barbie wasn't a doll that you had to baby or take care of. You could create her. She could be a doctor, a model, a fashion designer, a movie star, a rock star, an ice skater, a lawyer, a teacher, or a CEO. Barbie represents inspiration and liberation. On the trauma side of things, for me, Barbie also represented safety and innocence. When I was going through a traumatic time as a child, I coped through my toys and my safe place with Barbie and her dream house, because nothing could hurt Barbie and her safe, magical, pink, positive land. And the movie touches on this, and I think we should all have a safe place, and that was mine. Now, as an adult, my safe place in this world is helping others who have endured similar abusive and traumatic situations. In 2022, I transitioned my art show business, The Usual Art Specs, to a 501c3 nonprofit organization that provides art therapy and other resources for female survivors of domestic violence, sexual abuse, and sex trafficking. The foundation of starting a nonprofit began in 2020. The pandemic changed the world. That time in spring of 2020, it gave me the chance to really reevaluate my life and what was truly important and search for what my heart had actually been calling me to do for years. This came with a lot of fear. It meant facing my own truths and my own traumas. Thankfully, I didn't actually think it through, because that might have stopped me, honestly. I simply just took the very first step. And that first step was to create an online platform for women like me who had been sexually abused and were struggling and needed support. This was a monumental time to begin an online support group for abused women. Many of us had lost our jobs and could not afford therapy, and the ones that could afford it did not have access to it as the world was shut down. Originally, my vision for this group was to have a few online meetings during lockdown, and once we, quote unquote, flattened the curve, which is so cute that we believe that was a thing, by the way. Then I figured we'd start meeting in person in Grapevine or the Dallas-Fort Worth area, because we were all convinced this was only going to last a few weeks, maybe a month, maybe 2 tops. So that was my original vision, transferring this group to a public meeting in DFW. Well, as another week went by and another week went by, we had women calling in from not only Grapevine, Dallas, and Fort Worth They were calling in from Houston, Austin, and San Antonio, all throughout Texas. A few more weeks went by, and women were calling in from New York, LA, Massachusetts, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Washington, and Arizona, really all over the United States. A few more weeks went by, and women were calling in from Canada. They were calling in from London in the UK and even the Philippines. We had several hundred members with only a matter of months. We met every week for over a year, even when I had COVID. One of the ladies helped me lead the group. I was still on the call, but with my camera off, of course, and in bed. We were unstoppable. Week after week, I learned so much from these women. We were a group of all different backgrounds, races, sexual orientations, and our ages ranged from 16 to 65. We were all so different, and our stories were so different, but our aftermath and our emotions were exactly the same, like alarmingly so. There was something so powerful about sharing our stories and truly, truly being validated that we weren't going crazy. We weren't abnormal. We weren't broken. There wasn't something wrong with us. We were traumatized. We were suffering from PTSD, suffering from anxiety, suffering from depression, and many, many other symptoms because we had unhealed trauma. This spoke to me and shook me to my core. In April of 2021, the COVID mandates finally lifted in Texas, and everyone was excited to be working and meeting in person again. At this time, I started an art show business. It took off fast, and we held art and artisan markets all over DFW. Our first event was in May, and we managed to execute 12 that first year. At the same time, I was still meeting each week and running the online support group for sexual assault survivors. By that December, I knew with all of my heart that I wanted to start a nonprofit. So I combined my two passions of art and the art shows, along with advocating for sexual abuse survivors. Today, years later, we still hold art shows, but all proceeds go towards programs to provide art therapy for underserved women suffering the aftermaths of abuse. So that is where the trauma of Trauma Barbie comes from. So along with the empowering dynamics of Barbie and the profound, painful depths of trauma, this podcast still vows to keep our conversations not just meaningful, but uplifting and entertaining. Laughter is my love language, and humor is my favorite coping mechanism. Laughter has literally been proven to kill cancer cells. Sometimes, in the race of today's society, we are so focused on either being constantly stimulated by technology and social media, or so overworked and overstressed in the never-ending competition to get ahead and prove ourselves that we forget to take care of ourselves. My favorite way to do that is to laugh. This podcast will also hopefully serve as not only beneficial, relatable, and validating to those who listen, but also be a place of silliness and entertainment. Each episode will likely have a guest who is someone influential in their line of work, but also vulnerable enough to share their trauma along with a silly story or two. We'll discuss everything from our traumatic childhoods to red flags when dating to celebrity pop culture. That's right, they've got trauma too. And we're not here to judge, we're here to discuss and to relate. And that about wraps up this episode. Thank you for tuning in. Our next episode, I interview Tasha Ballard from Exim Performance. We'll be chatting about leadership, abandonment, trauma, and you guessed it, Barbie. We'll see you soon. This podcast is something that we do for fun. It is not directly associated to my day job, which is founder and executive director of the nonprofit The Usual Art Specs. However, if you would like to donate to our nonprofit, all funds go directly towards providing art therapy and other resources for female survivors of sexual trauma and domestic violence. We greatly appreciate your consideration and support. To donate, please go to www.theusualartspecs.com. You can also find us on Facebook, as The Usual Art Specs and Instagram as The Usual Art Specs DFW. Our podcast also has its own Instagram account. To stay up to date on new episodes, follow us at Trauma Barbie Podcast. Bye, Barbie.